Good evening and welcome to the show. This evening my guest is the Prince of Jordan. He is now the High Commissioner of the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. Good evening and welcome to the show. Mr. High Commissioner, starting off,
thank you.
You met several high-ranking officials of the government as well as the opposition during your stay in Sri Lanka. What were the outcomes of these meetings?
Well, it was my first visit to Sri Lanka and a very constructive visit, if I may say so. The meetings I had in the first couple of days focused very much on the views of victims groups, civil society, both in Colombo and in the northern and eastern provinces, but also too in Kandy. And I conveyed to the senior-most officials of the state my impressions, having listened to those in those provinces. We had an exchange of views on many of the central issues, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about, and I came away better informed about their government's intentions.
President, in an interview to the BBC, Mr. High Commissioner said that international judges will not be included to investigate alleged war crimes in Sri Lanka, and then you had the Prime Minister saying that what was promised in Geneva will be delivered. Two schools of thought comes into play. Did you raise this issue up with the President and the Prime Minister when you met them?
It was raised. It really didn't need to be, because I think they're aware of what the UN preference is. Ultimately, and we made clear to all our distinguished interlocutors, it is the victims who will decide whether enough is enough. And the victims from all communities, not one community or not one part of that community, it's all communities. And through this consultative process, which the government is and has declared its intention to pursue, we feel that the eventual position will emerge, that the government has stated its position, that it has no desire to bring in international participation, or that it would be open, is actually quite normal, in the sense that as you look at it in detailed form, you might have arrived at a different conclusion. Ultimately, though, and I have to say this, please forgive me, that it is the sovereign decision of the Sri Lankan government to take this. It's not for the UN to impose any decision. We make recommendations that we feel are well merited, and it's up to Sri Lanka.
The Geneva resolution, Mr. High Commissioner, co-sponsored by Sri Lanka last October, demands for a hybrid court. How flexible is the High Commissioner's office regarding this proposal?
We recommended a hybrid court, and the Human Rights Council endorsed the recommendation. But of course, as I just said, if in the process of consultations the victims' voices have a certain opinion, I think the government, even if it has reservations or a dislike for international participation, this ultimately may change. Now, it may change. We don't know if it will or not, but it's normal that we have this discussion with the Sri Lankan government.
Ms. High Commissioner, there is resistance in terms of including foreign judges in the judicial process of Sri Lanka to look into alleged war crimes in the island. Don't you believe the sovereignty, the unity, the independence, the territorial integrity of the country would be threatened by such a move?
I don't believe so. I mean, in many parts of the world, you see foreign nationals occupy central positions within a state. I mean, you only have to look at the governor of the Bank of England, who is a Canadian national, and the Bank of England is one of the oldest central banks. In a world where countries are regularly seeking the support of international institutions and other countries, we didn't believe when we made that recommendation that it should be an inhibiting factor.
The stand of the United Nations changed dramatically following the 8th of January polls last year, Mr. High Commissioner. What was the reason behind this? Is it because the UN and the international community disliked the Rajapaksa regime?
It was not a matter of personal dislikes or personal feelings. The office that I am proud to represent was tasked with conducting a human rights investigation by the Human Rights Council we had been in discussion with the previous government, and the previous government had, of course, a very defined view, a strong view against the United Nations involvement in these issues. And with the new government, initially the position was not that different, but what we began to see from the President through his public utterances is that there was a shift away from the sort of tone and tenor that the previous government had in respect of reconciliation, in respect of dealing with the past, in respect of confronting the past. And this is very much in keeping with the view of my office. And over the course of the year, steadily, we've had more and more contacts. And it of course, enabled my being able to visit Sri Lanka.
What is the assurance you have from this government in terms of accountability and reconciliation? Do you think that they are taking concrete measures to move ahead in terms of the likings of the international community and even the United Nations, Mr. High Commissioner?
Well, the feeling I had is that there are steps being taken. I mean, very clearly there are steps. But there is also clear frustration on the part of many of the victim communities that would like to see more done. So the military has released, of course, territory that was formerly under their control. Private property has been returned. But to those who are living in welfare camps, the desperation with which they want to return home is such that the frustration is there because they're not going home immediately. Similarly with the missing and those presumed disappeared, the need for information is very much an acute thing for them. And I think there is progress. It is not as fast as many would want, but it is also clearly detectable.
Mr. High Commissioner, do you think that accountability and reconciliation could be achieved overnight?
Not overnight, but it could be achieved. And I feel that if Sri Lanka is given a chance to pursue the aspirations of its leaders, it can achieve this. It is mightily difficult. Few countries are able to look back at the past and absorb the enormity of what has happened when things are not altogether glorious. I mean, Sri Lanka has a lot to be proud about, but I think clearly in our report there's a painful series of episodes that it has passed through, and a determination to examine it with a clear and unaffected view, I'd say politically, would be to the great benefit of Sri Lanka and to the international community.
Let's take a look at South Africa, Mr. High Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
Even following the fall of the apartheid, still people are reeling from the wounds of the apartheid. Can you justify the fact that a 3-decade-long war, can everything be hunky-dory in a few years? Can that be accepted?
I think you actually answered your own question. It's never easy to do, and if it were, many other countries would be following that sort of process. It's never easy to do. For instance, in many security services around the world that have emerged after dictatorships have lapsed, the muscle memory is still working. Even though the countries have changed, their new constitutions, new independent commissions, we still receive complaints that the security services are the same, operating the same as they had once done in dictatorships in those other countries. And so what we realize is that this is work that needs to be done, but it has to be steady and deliberate, and it will require time. And the point that you're making, that it's almost generational, is well accepted. But there has to be a starting point, and we believe that Sri Lanka is at that starting point.
Most of the communications that have come out from the United Nations over the last few years, Mr. High Commissioner, in particular after the 2009, following the end of the conflict, majority of the blame has been placed on the security forces. Do you really believe so?
Well, I think you probably interviewed my predecessor, and she was very clear and she was very blunt about the ruthlessness of the LTTE, which I repeated again today. And we have not hidden our gaze or shielded ourselves from the enormous suffering that this group has caused so many innocent people in Sri Lanka. So I don't believe that our views are partial in that sense at all. And I think we have, if read properly, you will see this in our report.
Taking into account what you're saying right now, Mr. High Commissioner, there are many LTTE leaders still living in Sri Lanka and overseas as we speak right now. Why is not the UN demanding an investigation against them? Why are you not so enthusiastic about these men?
But if you look at our report, all the questions that you're raising are more or less dealt with. We have said that there have been massive abuses committed by the LTTE. As I had said in the press conference, our investigation was a human rights investigation. In other words, we're looking at broad patterns. The criminal investigation that must follow will look at individual responsibility. We didn't get to that stage yet, and that's why you must have a criminal inquiry to follow, which is all part of this necessary structure that the government has to begin to construct, basically building on the consultations that it will have with its own people.
Many human rights violations have been reported from Iraq, Afghanistan. You had the British Prime Minister, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, saying that Iraq was a mistake and weapons of mass destruction was never found from Iraq as well, which was one of the causes to invade the country. Why is that, Mr. High Commissioner, that powerful nations get away with a simple sorry and countries like Sri Lanka are on the spotlight?
Well, you might have that impression. I can assure you, since I have become High Commissioner, and I ask you to just consult, the website that we have, you will see that I have, when I believe it's merited, I have spared no one from comments made by my office. We are not an international criminal court. I do not have prosecutorial powers. There are other institutions that will do that. What we do is we promote and defend, or we promote human rights. We call for those who violate human rights to be held accountable. There are other institutions which will determine individual responsibility. And that's my response to your question.
Why all this, Mr. High Commissioner? 7 years following the end of the conflict, why are we opening the wounds that were left behind by the civil war in Sri Lanka?
I wouldn't say you're opening the wounds. I would say the wounds are still very open themselves. I mean, clearly there was a military victory and a military defeat, and the armed group, the terrorist group that was defeated, has lapsed. It is at these moments when the state must be most magnanimous, must seem to make repair. If you look at a global stage, and in the context of the Second World War, I think the Allied powers realized that the punitive measures taken against Germany post the First World War led to then the evolution, or led to the development of a context and a circumstance that produced the Second World War. And so the second time around, on a global stage, the Allied powers reacted much more magnanimously. In the national context, in many countries, we similarly, once the fighting is over, it's a time for healing, it is a time for ensuring that the country comes together. What we have realized in dealing with many, many conflicts is that if you avert your gaze from what is happening in here, so you can build roads, you can build bridges, you can build institutions, you can train, but if you don't deal with the pain of individuals, the suffering of individuals, it lies deep within, and eventually it can come back. And that's what I think we're urging all countries who are emerging from conflict to take very seriously. And we hope and we believe that Sri Lanka would be a model for other countries.
What is the final objective of all this, Mr. High Commissioner? Is it to take the security forces to the International Criminal Court, or even the members of the Rajapaksa regime? Is that the final objective?
No, all we said is that we believe there's sufficient evidence to merit a subsequent criminal investigation by Sri Lanka, and we suggested a hybrid facility for this. The Sri Lankan government has an initial position. It needs to conduct consultations. The eventual position of the government will be determined by these consultations, and we'll see where we are. I mean, you're leaping way ahead here and making suggestions. We don't know where the evidence will lead. And it's only when you have a criminal investigation that the evidence will lead you to particular persons. Who those persons are yet to be determined.
You will be making an oral submission at the 32nd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, that is in June, and then at the 34th session, Mr. High Commissioner, a written submission is to be made by you again on Sri Lanka. What is next?
Well, what is next is that we will continue to remain in contact with the Sri Lankan authorities. We will see what will happen in due course with the plans for constitutional reform, for the work that is started now or has started now in terms of setting up a task force for the consultations and so forth. And all of that we will stay in contact with, and you can ask me at the 32nd session of my views when we get to that point about where Sri Lanka has reached in that context.
My final question to you, Mr. High Commissioner, the Syrian conflict, many have been stranded, many have been left dead. The numbers are on the rise. An organization like the UN, an organization like that you represent, what are you doing about all this that is taking place in the world?
We have spoken out consistently without any reservation about the horrors that have occurred in Syria from the very beginning. My predecessor was one of the most outspoken, one of the first people to really take a tough position. That the Security Council has been unable to forge a collective position on Syria has been a tragedy, really, for the people of Syria. What they have been suffering has been appalling in every respect, and my office has spared no effort wherever we brief the Human Rights Council, the Security Council, of shedding light on these issues. And we will continue to do that.
Do you think the UN has to be restructured, Mr. High Commissioner? Is that what you're trying to say?
This is another question. I believe, though, that the Security Council, has a responsibility to arrest conflicts that start and become centrifugal, and sadly, in respect of Iraq and Syria and a number of other conflicts, this has not been possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. High Commissioner.
Thank you so much
this evening on our show.
Thank you so much. This has been a much more friendly, cooperative and encouraging visit than the one my predecessor endured in August 2013, which, as you may recall, was marred by the vituperative attacks on her integrity simply because she addressed a number of burning human rights issues that any High Commissioner for Human Rights would have raised at the time. I am aware that some of the same people have given me a similar welcome. I've seen the posters, but I am pleased that in the new environment in Sri Lanka, all voices, including the moderate voices of civil society, can at last be heard, even if sometimes the voices of hatred and bigotry are still shouting the loudest, and as a result are perhaps being listened to more than they deserve. Sri Lanka has come a long way in the past year, as you, the media, are only too aware, given the much greater freedom you now have to write what you wish to write and report what you feel you should report. The element of fear has considerably diminished, at least in Colombo and the south. In the north and the east it has mutated, but sadly still exists. Virtually everyone agrees that there has been progress, although opinions differ markedly about the extent of that progress. Several recent highly symbolic steps have been taken that have had a positive impact on intercommunal relations, including the decision taken to sing the national anthem in both Sinhala and Tamil on Independence Day for the first time since the early 1950s. The following day, in a reciprocal gesture, the Chief Minister of the Northern Province paid a respectful visit to a Buddhist temple in Jaffna. And in January, the President pardoned the convicted LTTE prisoner who once plotted to assassinate him. These are significant steps on the path of reconciliation between the two communities, both of which bear their own deep scars from the years of conflict. Distracted by this conflict, Sri Lanka has also failed to address critical issues facing women, people with disabilities, people with different sexual orientations, and other groups suffering discrimination, such as the plantation Tamils in central Sri Lanka. I hope that these and other neglected or discriminated against groups and minorities will now receive the attention they deserve, not least in the constitutional reform process. Repairing the damage done by a protracted conflict is a task of enormous complexity, and the early years are crucial. If mistakes are made or significant problems are downplayed or ignored during the first few years, they become progressively harder to sort out as time goes on. While there is much support for the very important proposed constitutional reform, which should ensure the rights of all Sri Lankans, or that the rights of all Sri Lankans are fully recognized, there are also fears that at a later stage this may be achieved at the expense of other equally important processes such as truth-telling, justice, and accountability. Prime Minister's recent statement that nearly all the disappeared persons are dead has created great distress among their families who until then still had hope. This statement must be followed by rapid action to identify precisely who is still alive and who has died or been killed, properly account for their deaths, including whether or not they were unlawful, identify the location of their remains, and provide redress. There are many myths and misconceptions about the resolution and what it means for Sri Lanka. It is not a gratuitous attempt to interfere with or undermine the country's sovereignty or independence. It is not some quasi-colonial act by some nebulous foreign power. The acceptance of the resolution was a moment of strength, not weakness, by Sri Lanka. The world wants Sri Lanka to be a success story. For a country to be stable, to be a success, it needs to have a strong, impartial, and credible justice system. Sri Lanka has many excellent judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officials. But over the years, the system they depended on, and which depends on them, became highly politicized, unbalanced, unreliable. It is for these reasons that the report and the Human Rights Council resolution suggest international participation in the accountability mechanisms set up to deal with international crimes and gross human rights violations committed by individuals on both sides. Only a year ago, large numbers of Sri Lankans voted for change, for reconciliation, for truth, for justice. It would be a great shame if a minority of extreme voices on both sides who are bent on disruption are allowed or were allowed to prevail by creating fear where there should have been hope. Sri Lanka needs a serious debate about these very serious issues on which its future depends.